Mary Tamm, First Generation, the Autobiography, read by the Timekeys, Romana. Chapter 18, 2003, Whocruise. Anchors, Aweigh. Since the tragic capsize of the Estonia, which occurred a couple years after my visit to my parents' homeland, I had been understandably nervous about boat travel. I had been offered floating conventions before, and had turned them down, but now decided to take the plunge and travel to Los Angeles with my daughter, Lauryn, to join a cruise bound for Mexico. She was interested in checking out American colleges with a view to doing a course in LA, and I was always happy to visit that city where I had great friends and loved to shop. Also, it seemed like a great opportunity for some fun, as I was not to be traveling on my own. Not only did I have Lauryn with me, but I was also to join the other celebrities who had been invited along, namely Peter Davidson, the Fifth Doctor, Deborah Watling, and writer Keith Topping. So I was in a great mood when we touched down at LAX airport, despite the 12-hour journey in cattle class. We collected our bags, weary but in good spirits, found the arrivals hall, and waited. And waited. Dan Harris, the floating cons organizer, who was due to meet us, was nowhere to be seen. Luckily, I had some dollars on me, so after hanging around for nearly an hour, we took a taxi to the hotel. Not a great start, and one that did not augur well for our stay. My heart sank even further when we reached the West Coast Hotel on Long Island to find that Dan was not there either. Deborah and her friend, Alan Langley, whom I knew from various Who events, had arrived before us and were in a state of similar anxiety. Of our third Who guest, Peter Davidson, there was no sign. We threw ourselves on each other in a hysterical welcome and decided to try and contact Dan on his mobile, as Alan fortunately had his number. No reply. What to do? Thankfully, the hotel had a record of registration for us, so at least we had a bed for the night, which was not the case with the berths on the boat later, as you will hear. However, they insisted on taking our credit card numbers, which made us even more worried. What if Dan never turned up, and we would be stuck in the hotel with a huge bill and no means of contacting him? We managed to cheer ourselves up with a meal together, as it was nearly evening, and decided to sleep on it. I was tired, jet-lagged, and now anxious and a little irate, so did not sleep at all well. Actually, none of us did. What a bizarre start to the convention this was. Dan's phone was still on voicemail the next morning. Alan had resourcefully found out from contacts in England that Peter was staying at another hotel. We decided to go there. Maybe we might be able to track down the elusive Mr. Harris, too. After a hasty breakfast, we had a quick look at the luxury cruise liner Queen Mary, now out of service and moored nearby as a popular tourist lure. We had no time to do the tour, but marveled at the grandiose, stately exterior of that historic vessel. Just as we were about to jump into a taxi, lo and behold, Dan turned up, full of apologies. Apparently, his phone was out of order. And his car too, I wondered, given the lack of meet-and-greet service at the airport. His reception from us all was somewhat frosty, to say the least. He herded us into a minibus, and we drove to Peter's hotel and asked for him at reception, but were told he had not yet checked in. This was becoming really frustrating, so Alan said he would call him to check if he was on his way, Dan's phone not having an international roaming facility. I decided to pop outside for a cigarette, and ran straight into Peter, who had just come from the airport. As we greeted each other, Alan rang Peter again, and a three-way conversation took place, with my voice echoing in the background, as we both explained the situation so far. We all adjourned to the bar, which was closed, with no food or drink to be had. Dan suggested we try the vending machine. This was unbelievable. He seemed to have no change for the machine, so we all clubbed together to try and have a bottle of water between us, but the machine was not working either. Then we noticed a water dispenser nearby. Our only hope of refreshment. We drank deeply as our moods darkened. Dan actually turned out to be a very nice guy. He was most contrite at the lack of any kind of welcome, and our expenses were eventually reimbursed, but although he was full of good intentions, it was clear that he could not organize the proverbial drinking session in an alcoholic beverage facility. We had to wait for the shuttle bus to take us to the ship, but Dan wasn't sure when it was coming. Peter and Alan saw one, decided that looked like it, and started loading our cases on board, only for Dan to begin unloading them again, saying he didn't think that was it. Needless to say, Peter and Alan were right. We were whisked away to the port. The weather was unseasonably cloudy, and indeed it looked like rain. So far it had been sunny and warm. Did this dark sky augur further gloom and doom? Unfortunately, it did. Preparing for our embarkation, we joined the long queues that snaked around posts and barriers for what seemed like an age, then began to fill in endless forms. Being asked for credit card details, we turned to Dan expectantly, who looked at us blankly. After much discussion, matters were eventually resolved when Alan told him firmly that it was just not on to expect us to pay for drinks at dinner. Peter was saying, "Go on, Alan, you sort it. We're right behind you." Well, a few paces behind you. Well, quite a few yards. That's when we all knew it was going to be a hoot. We were all rather tired by this time due to jet lag and dehydration, and somehow all managed to lose each other. On board ship, eventually, we began ringing each other on our mobiles, thank God for modern technology, to try and arrange to meet up. Our cabins, it transpired, were all on the same deck. There were 5 tiers in all, comprising the huge ocean cruiser somewhat inaptly named Ecstasy. It looked like a giant wedding cake close up and towered above us into the brooding skies. I was a little nervy. How could this monster ever float? The Queen Mary was tiny compared to this. After finding our cabin, which was the size of a doormat, Lauryn and I sank back gratefully onto the narrow bunks for a well-earned rest. Almost immediately, an ear-splitting klaxon blared out, causing us to jump up again, our hearts pounding. A deep, stentorian voice thundered instructions for lifeboat drill. Crikey, was the boat sinking already? We hastily donned our life jackets and raced up to the assigned meeting place, joining masses of stampeding crowds along the way. The jackets were huge and bulky, and there were some comedy moments when people bounced off and against each other. What chaos! On the appointed deck we were told to sit down and be quiet, and rather reminded me of school assembly. And then a boring half-hour of lifeboat drill ensued. The ship was not sinking after all, as we perched in our life jacket hundreds on the hard deck benches, rather reminiscent of the last scene in Titanic. Whew, so this was normal practice on a cruise, then. It would have been nice to be forewarned. Thanks again, Dan. We all immediately trooped back to our cabins about 4 hours from our arrival at the port. Give me air travel any day, and arranged to meet Peter, Debbie, and Alan. As we were in such close proximity, we decided to have a get-together in my cabin. A bottle of champagne had been thoughtfully provided, and it was begging to be drunk. Having peeled off the rather smelly life jackets, Lauryn and I went up on deck to wave goodbye to Los Angeles en route for Mexico. I felt rather better now I could feel the ship actually floating and moving. This might not be so bad, after all, and I'd never been to Mexico before. As ever, with the prospect of new horizons in sight, I cheered up immediately. As the sun sank, the others knocked on my cabin door, and we squashed onto the bunks, cheek by jowl, to mull over the story so far. As the wine was drunk, quite fast I may add, we became more and more hilariously silly, deciding that it had all been a great lark. Poor Alan had been overlooked when the bunks had been allocated, and was designated to sleep in Dan's cabin. All 3 men were tall and well-built, so it was not an easy exercise, it later turned out, for them all to maneuver to and from the cupboard-sized bathroom before settling down for the night. Dan had manfully volunteered to sleep on the floor. Alan looked wild-eyed the next morning, having had little sleep due to the loud snoring from his cabin mates, especially Dan, who had no trouble dropping off on his hard mat, but carried on magnificently under the arduous circumstances, going on to become our leader and spokesman when every conceivable detail of the already muddled agenda went haywire. What a star! Now we were settling into an easy and jokey companionship. I had only met Peter and Debbie briefly in the past, and it was gratifying to release that we were all of a similar mindset, namely, slightly off the wall, and quite plucky in the face of adversity, which was battled with humour. The air in the cabin became quite foul and fugged as we all dragged heavily on cigarettes. Debbie, Lauryn, and I were smokers, and Peter and Alan decided within about 5 minutes that they were too. Pleasantly merry, we thought it a good idea to open a window to clear the cabin of smoke. Oh no! They were screwed tight, and we all remembered too late that, of course, portholes are not openable. We made a plan to meet in a different cabin each night from now on to pollute the air by rotation, as it were. We all had a free bottle of bubbly, Dan's little gift, so could at least have 3 more nights of free booze to boot. The terms of our work on the cruise were surprisingly flexible. We had no fee, just our flights and accommodation paid for. I had paid for Lauryn's flight myself, so the idea was that it would be rather like a free holiday. The only stipulation was that we would dine with the Doctor Who fans in the evenings, and at the end of the week's trip take part in an event, which I will explain later. For now, as we dressed for dinner, we just had the evening's performance to execute. I was amazed to discover that the ship, which held about 2,000 people, only had about 30 or so fans on board. So, during the day, we were more or less left to our own devices, not bothered by anything or anyone. It was a really cushy gig, and quite unlike the hard slog that I had come to expect at normal, land-bound conventions. I looked forward to 7 days of sunning myself on the spacious decks. Naive fool that I was. We entered the dining room and gasped in delight. Unlike the rather shabby, cramped cabin, this was a huge, gorgeously decorated, sumptuous ballroom filled with 70 or so large tables dressed with exquisite white tablecloths and sparkling silverware. Flowers spilled from tall vases, and low lighting glinted from overhead chandeliers. It was superb. We sat at our appointed tables and met the fans, who were all lovely. A new guest was introduced to us, Bob May, who played the robot in the original series of Lost in Space, Sci-Fi classic, much loved by fans everywhere, but especially so in America. Bob turned out to be a wonderfully entertaining guy, telling corny jokes and keeping everyone amused with his wealth of anecdotes. His favorite joke was, "What's the hardest part of playing golf?" Getting out of the cart. And his second favorite, "I don't know a Doctor Who, but I know a Dr. Smith," which left us all a bit perplexed until it was explained that the latter was a Lost in Space character. Yes, okay, admittedly not the wittiest of wits, but we were hysterical by the time he told them for the 20th time. You had to be there, believe me. A very pleasant evening ensued, with the most delicious food, 5 courses in all, and excellent service, 10 out of 10 for that, at least. Wine and conversation flowed easily, and again everyone got on like a house on fire. We, the guests, started to relax and enjoy ourselves after the very difficult start to the trip. Moods and tempers lightened. We said our goodnights and tottered away to our cabins for a good night's sleep, rocked in the arms of the ecstasy. I drifted off to the strangely soothing throb of the ship's engines in my ears, and the pungent stink of nicotine in my nostrils. The rocking of the ship became less soothing and more turbulent. I woke briefly in the night and registered this fact, dismissed it as a figment of my sleep-induced imagination. But when Lauryn and I awoke the next morning, we gazed upon a stormy, pitching sea from our solitary porthole, and realized that our planned day of sunbathing was not now on the cards after all. We all convened for breakfast, the usual suspects, Peter, Debbie, Alan, and Lauryn, and myself. The ship was due to stop at Catalina Island that day, where a tour was scheduled for sightseeing and shopping. We had all been looking forward to it after all. The terms of the week's holiday, with its stop-offs on the way to Mexico, had been part of the lure. Now the rain was pelting us sideways from the open seas, with a freezing cold wind lashing the waves that sent spray surges onto the open decks. We helped ourselves to a buffet, piling our plates high with comfort food, and then went back down to our cabins to find something warmer to wear. I had one cardigan with me, and Lauryn had a shawl which were to do service for the rest of the week. This was summer, after all. Little did we realize that morning that we were heading into California's only unseasonable storm that year. Part of the tedious boarding process had included being issued with a key or registration card the size and shape of a credit card, which was like a passport. No one was allowed to disembark or re-embark without one. We were advised to keep these keys with us at all times. an instruction not easy to comply with if one happened to have no bag or pocket, or, as was the case with some of us, merely a bad memory. Despite the weather, it was announced that the planned stop-off at Catalina Island would take place, and we were given times to correspond with our cabin numbers, in order to board the small boats that would ferry us ashore from the Ecstasy. This region of sea was where Natalie Wood had drowned in 1981, a fact on which I reflected soberly as we queued up to take our places on the boats. She had always been a favorite actress of mine, and had died tragically and unexpectedly young. Debbie and Bob were just ahead of me, Lauryn, Alan, and Peter in the queue, and just as they were shepherded onto a boat ahead of us, I realized that I had left my passport key in my cabin. Peter and Alan rolled their eyes skywards in disbelief, but kindly said they would wait for me while I fetched it. I raced along the rolling corridors, ricocheting widely from wall to wall as the boat's pitch grew more extreme. This caused me so much amusement, I ended up laughing hysterically and wasting more time as I tried to pull myself together. Back at the queue, the others told me that Debbie and Bob had gone off, and that we were to go in the next vessel. Just then, a huge, ear-splitting shriek filled the air. It sounded like an amplified Who monster in the throes of labor. What on earth was it? Nearby, crew members sprang into action and raced off in all directions, leaving the already nervous passengers clutching each other in terror. The stentorian voice boomed out over the PA system. There was no need for alarm, ladies and gentlemen. The anchor had come adrift, but there was no need to panic. It was all under control. Oh, good. The boat was now floating untethered in the shallows. Ha! No need to panic. Hello! Everything under control? Yeah, right. There seemed no appropriate response to this news but to collapse in a fit of giggling, which did not stop until we heard another loud grinding noise, followed by another announcement. Thankfully, the anchor situation was now rectified, but there were to be no more boats leaving for Catalina, due to the rather dangerous storm conditions. Bing bong! This is your cruise director. You may have noticed we are experiencing a little bit of bad weather, so unfortunately the trips to Catalina Island are cancelled, because here at Carnival we are only concerned with your safety. Cue more maniacal laughter from us all. Unfortunately, this announcement had come rather too late for Debbie and Bob, who had already left. We rushed to the side of the ship and could just make out the tiny speck of their vessel as it tossed up and down on the Pacific Ocean. Not so specific at this moment in time. The boat was trying to turn back, but was in difficulties. We all breathed a sigh of relief when we saw it returning, and half an hour later, Debbie joined us on deck, soaked to the skin, her hair plastered to her head and a small frame shivering. She looked like a drowned kitten, and we did not know whether to cry or laugh. We chose the latter, and she sportingly joined in. Our trip so far had lurched from disaster to disaster, but we found it all enormously entertaining, having each other to share it with. Peter had his camcorder with him at all times, and now recorded Debbie's discomfiture for posterity. She grinned obligingly and went off to a cabin for a shower and a change of clothes. Oh, what a trooper. We had a lucky escape, thanks to my memory lapse, a fact which I constantly reminded the boys for the rest of the week, and still now, several years later, actually. We all adjourned back to the dining deck for a second breakfast. Peter piled his plate up, as he invariably did, and also had 3 puddings. He then casually announced that he had a bed scene to do in the new teleseries he was filming when he got back to England. He was somewhat mystified when we all broke into gales of laughter. That night we heard from Debbie the terrifying details of a round trip on the high seas, when she had also thought of Natalie Wood, and literally feared for her life as the vessel carrying her was subject to the ocean's cruelty. It had all looked so innocuous from a distance, but she too had a lucky escape. We cracked open a new bottle of champagne and chain-smoked away in her tiny cabin, marvelling at the fact that we were all alive and well. Then we repaired to the dining room, where we feasted on another slap-up meal and regaled the fans with the day's events. That night, Mother Nature gave us a break, and the weather calmed down. The boat steamed steadily on its course, and even though the weather next morning was cold, wet, and windy, the previous day's storms had abated. Sunbathing was definitely out, so we hooked up with a couple of fans we had become friendly with, Matt and Peter, and went off in search of the internet room, where we played happily with the computers for a while. I was not as computer literate then as I am now, i.e. a complete nerd, and was most impressed with Alan and Peter's knowledge about gigabytes, hard drives, and the like, vowing that I would learn more about the technology, which I did in due course. After this, we checked out the ship's entertainment schedule, wandering in and out of the various shows and movies that were constantly on offer. We took in a particularly funny half hour of Elvis impersonators, and then had a game of Scrabble. In between all this activity, we had tea, walked on deck, and sat in the outside jacuzzi, not as unpleasant as it sounds in the pouring rain, as it was deserted and very refreshing. The day flew by with lots of sparkling wit and conversation, keeping us laughing for hours, and then it was time for a nightly ritual of champagne and ciggies, in Peter's cabin this time, followed by dinner and bed. The following day was still grim, weather-wise, and passed in much the same way. Although hanging out together was fun, we all agreed we were suffering somewhat from cabin fever, and though we were only dimly aware of our duties regarding the fan event, it was always difficult to A. find Dan, and B. pin him down. We were told that we were to help out the fans, who were writing a Who-based story for the final evening of the cruise, when a winner would be announced, but only if we felt like it. We had a few wild goose chases, hearing that a writer's workshop was taking place in a particular room on the ship, only to arrive at the appointed place and find no one there. Alan, as usual, was superb at finding out what, if anything, was going on, but even he gave up trying in the end. The ship was enormous, and it became too frustrating rushing from one end to the other, wasting hours, literally, trying to track down the elusive riders. Despite this, I became very fond of Dan, as he was such a sweet guy, just not totally switched on. I suppose that is why, in the end, we all look back on the floating convention now and consider that a good time was had by all. Mexico was in sight. This time we were definitely getting off and could not wait. How did sailors cope with long sea voyages, we wondered. We were itching to place our feet back on dry land. However, we were warned that some of us would find it difficult to balance for the first half hour or so, having become so inured to the ship's motion. I did not believe it as I hopped off the gangplank and onto the shore with no difficulty whatsoever, until I saw a few poor people literally fall over. Bizarre. The small town of Ensenada, where we had docked, was picturesque and colourful, with prosperous-looking locals who were no doubt beneficiaries of the Yankee tourist dollar. We put on our plastic macks, it was still raining, and boarded a bus which took us to a local beauty spot. It was all rather reminiscent of Cornwall scenery-wise. Peter recorded it on his cam as usual, as we watched a huge spray of water spouting out of a blowhole in the sea. Others stayed to watch it below several times, but once was enough for me and Lauryn, so we wandered not too far away to a street market, which we had spotted from the bus. Disappointingly expensive, I thought, even with the prized discount. Peter, Debbie, and Alan wandered over after a while, and we lunched in a local Mexican cafe before heading back to the bus, and thence the boat. A day on shore had provided a great tonic, and we were in even higher spirits that evening as we drank and smoked the cocktail hour away, back in my cabin again. We ordered another bottle of bubbles, why break the habit of a week time, for which we diligently shared the expense. We were nothing if not honourable. I had now seen Mexico, but only briefly, which was perhaps why I was somewhat underwhelmed by the whole experience. Been there, done that, got the t-shirt seemed the maxim of the moment. We were heading back to LA with no stops and had the final evening to look forward to. The fans had been working hard on their scripts, which were of a surprisingly high standard. Keith Topping, with whom we had hooked up only once or twice hitherto, he was writing in his cabin most of the time, was to be the judge, and all of us had by now managed to attend the non-obligatory workshop or two. It was in a mood of high expectation that we convened in the ship's library on the final night after dinner. We had danced a conga around the dining room and enjoyed the usual hilarity at the table. The library, like all the public saloons on the ship, was magnificent, kitted out in faux English antique style, with wooden panels and leather chairs. Discreet lighting glowed from green-shaded desk lamps. I was rather nervous, as I had to read out the story of the group I was monitoring, who had all put their heads together to come up with a gripping and imaginative tale. Peter, Debbie, and I read while the fans listened. Bob May introduced it all with a witty speech, and yes, you've guessed it, the golf cart and doctor jokes. We still laughed. He was such a dear, God rest his soul, and a true pro right to the end. He passed away in 2009. The evening finished with a brief signing session, and our work for the week was over. It would have been glorious had the weather been better, but as it was, we felt only relief as we finally docked at the port in Los Angeles, ironically in bright morning sunshine. Peter and Alan were somewhat miffed when their cases were mislaid and had to wait on the boat while the rest of us scampered off. We boarded a tour bus once all bags were retrieved, and set off on a jolly jaunt, which Dan had planned for us. This was the only part of the week that went smoothly. We cruised through the city, down Sunset Strip, and along the luxurious avenues of Beverly Hills, rubbernecking at the mansions of the rich and famous. Peter, as usual, recording every minute. The driver gave us a running commentary the while, telling us that if we were lucky, we might see some filming going on, although Peter, Debbie, and I were not too enthralled at the idea of a busman's holiday, and pointing out the police station where Hugh Grant was taken when he was arrested. Peter gave us his own, more interesting commentary. He had lived in Hollywood for a while when married to Sandra Dickinson, who had been filming the pilot for a TV series, and now pointed out the various places they had visited and lived in, relating anecdotes of their meetings with screen legends. As the morning wore on, we took Peter's lead and all took our cameras out, firing off pictures of each other and becoming sillier and sillier as the rather end-of-term mood intensified. We reached the world-renowned Chinese theater and jumped out to gaze on the names of all the greatest stars of Hollywood's history stamped into the sidewalk. I had already seen these on previous trips, but as usual, it is more fun to share the experience with my new mates. After a while, though, I spotted a nearby mall and dived into it with Lauryn. We had to be dragged back to the bus and set off for our final stop, the Plaza Hotel. While Peter was doing the large Gallifrey Con, a yearly event in LA, which I was to appear at myself a couple of years later. Debbie and Alan were leaving for the airport to catch a plane to London, but with some trepidation due to some news reports that evening. The war with Iraq was imminent, and because of a security incident at Heathrow, the airport was closed, with army tanks lined up on the runways in preparation for terrorist activity. Luckily, the reports had been exaggerated, and their plane took off without delays, thank goodness. Lauryn and I were staying on for a while longer with my friend Robin Sachs, an old rider buddy who now lived in L.A. He had been married to the actress Sion Phillips for many years and was now wed to an American lady, Casey, whom he met whilst working in Hollywood. We were to stay with them for the few remaining days of our stay, and I was really looking forward to catching up and chatting about old times. He pulled up at the hotel just as we were all saying our prolonged and fond farewells to one another. It was wonderful to see him, and we all chatted for a few moments before going off in our respective directions. We waved goodbye to Dan as we drove off until he was a mere speck in the rear window, then breathed a huge sigh of relief. Our adventure on the high seas was over, and now it was back to reality. The rest of our stay was peaceful and stress-free, and we eventually flew home feeling relaxed and happy. As for her course in L.A., Lauryn decided not to go for it after all. She insists her decision was nothing to do with her cruise experience, but I am not too sure.